Elena Marsh ran through the darkness of Blackthorn Forest, with her heart slamming against her ribs, branches tearing at her arms as she pushed forward without looking back. Behind her, distant voices called her name, and she knew if they caught her, she would never be free again. She had heard the stories about this forest long before she ever set foot near its edge. The people in the nearby town spoke of it only in whispers, warning travelers never to cross the old stone markers that lined its border. They said a king ruled these woods, a king who was not entirely a man, and that anyone foolish enough to trespass was never seen again. Elena had laughed at those stories once, sitting safely in her childhood home, with a cup of tea in her hands. Now, with her lungs burning, and her shoes soaked through from crossing a shallow stream, she understood that laughter had been a luxury she could no longer afford. She had left everything behind that night: her home, her name, the life she had built for herself in a small coastal town 200 miles away. She had packed only a single bag and disappeared into the night, after discovering a truth so dangerous that staying meant certain harm. The men chasing her were not ordinary criminals. They were organized, patient, and terrifyingly thorough, and they had been closing in on her for 3 days straight. When she saw the dark line of trees rising ahead of her in the moonlight, she did not think about legends or warnings. She thought only of survival, and she ran straight into the one place everyone told her never to go. The forest swallowed her whole. Within minutes, the sounds of pursuit faded behind her, replaced by an eerie silence broken only by her own ragged breathing and the crunch of leaves beneath her feet. The trees here were older than any she had ever seen, their trunks so wide that 3 people could not have wrapped their arms around them, their branches forming a canopy so thick that almost no moonlight reached the forest floor. She should have felt relief at losing her pursuers. Instead, a new and different fear began to creep through her chest, a primal sense that she was being watched by something far more patient and far more dangerous than the men she had left behind. She kept walking, because stopping felt more frightening than moving forward. Her legs ached, her feet were blistered, and her stomach had been empty for almost a full day, but she pressed on through the undergrowth, following what she hoped was a path deeper into the trees. At one point, she thought she heard something large moving parallel to her, matching her pace exactly, staying just beyond the range of her vision. She froze, pressing herself against the rough bark of an ancient oak, and listened. The sound stopped the moment she did. For several long minutes, she heard nothing but her own heartbeat, and she told herself it had been her imagination, a trick played by exhaustion and fear. It was not her imagination. Deep within Blackthorn Forest, in a stronghold built from stone and timber that had stood for centuries, Cale Ashwood felt the disturbance the moment it crossed the boundary line. He was not a man given to distraction, and yet something about this particular intrusion pulled at his attention in a way that felt different from the usual careless hunters or lost hikers who occasionally wandered too close to his territory. He rose from his seat by the great hearth, where he had been reviewing reports from his scouts about movement near the eastern border, and walked to the window that overlooked the darkened tree line. Cale Ashwood ruled Blackthorn Forest, not as a mayor or a governor might rule a town, but as something older and far more absolute. He was the alpha of a pack that had protected these woods for generations, and under his leadership, the boundary had become something sacred, something that outsiders crossed at their own tremendous risk. He had not chosen cruelty for its own sake. Every action he took was rooted in a devotion to protecting what remained of a world that had shrunk smaller and smaller as human cities pressed against the edges of the wild places. But devotion, when pushed to its limits by years of betrayal and loss, could harden into something that looked very much like ruthlessness to anyone standing on the outside of it. He called for Callum, his second in command, a broad-shouldered man with sharp eyes and an even sharper sense of loyalty. Callum arrived within moments, already sensing from Cale's posture that something unusual was happening. Cale told him simply that someone had crossed the eastern boundary and that a small group of scouts should locate the intruder before the night grew any older. He expected this to be routine. He expected his scouts to return within the hour, with news that the trespasser had been dealt with, according to the law that had governed this land for as long as anyone could remember. He did not expect what actually happened next. Elena had finally allowed herself to rest near a slow-moving stream, kneeling to splash cold water on her face and drink from cupped hands. The water was so cold it made her teeth ache, but it was the first relief she had felt in hours. She sat back against a smooth rock and closed her eyes for just a moment, telling herself she would rest for only a minute before continuing on. That single minute stretched longer than she intended, exhaustion pulling at her like a tide she could not resist. When she opened her eyes again, she was no longer alone. 4 wolves stood at the edge of the clearing, their eyes reflecting the faint moonlight in an unsettling silver glow. Elena's breath caught in her throat, and every instinct in her body screamed at her to run, but her legs felt frozen, rooted to the ground beneath her. She had never seen wolves this large, their shoulders nearly reaching her chest, their fur thick and dark as the shadows around them. She waited for the attack she was certain was coming, bracing herself, closing her eyes and thinking of everything she had left unfinished in her life. The attack never came. Instead, the largest of the wolves stepped forward slowly, lowering its massive head, and to Elena's astonishment, it did not approach her with aggression, but with something closer to curiosity. It circled her at a careful distance, sniffing the air around her, and then, remarkably, it sat down a few feet away, watching her with an intensity that felt less like a predator sizing up prey, and more like a guardian, assessing a responsibility it did not yet understand. The other 3 wolves followed its lead, forming a loose circle around her, not threatening but somehow protective, as though they had decided, without any words being exchanged, that she was under their watch now. Elena did not understand what was happening, but slowly, cautiously, the paralyzing fear in her chest began to ease into something more like disbelief. She had grown up around dogs on her family's small farm, and something in her recognized the shift in the wolves' posture, the way their ears had relaxed, the way their tails had lowered from an alert position into something calmer. She did not move for a long while, too afraid to test whatever strange truce had settled over the clearing, but eventually, when the wolves showed no sign of leaving or attacking, she allowed herself to breathe more easily. Word of this reached Kale within the hour, carried by a young scout named Nolan, who arrived at the stronghold slightly out of breath and clearly unsettled by what he had witnessed. He explained that the trespasser was a woman, alone, unarmed, and that the pack sent to intercept her had refused to carry out the usual course of action. Instead, they had surrounded her protectively, refusing to let any other wolves near, growling not at the woman, but at anyone who approached with hostile intent. Nolan admitted he had never seen anything like it in all his years running with the pack. Kale listened to this report with a stillness that unsettled even Callum, who stood nearby, watching his alpha's expression carefully. In all the years Kale had ruled this territory, no trespasser had ever been shown mercy, and no pack member had ever defied the standing order regarding intruders. The law existed for good reason. Every boundary crossing represented a potential threat, not just to the pack's safety, but to the fragile secret that allowed them to exist undiscovered in a world that had little tolerance left for creatures like them. If word ever spread that a human had wandered into Blackthorn Forest and lived to tell the story, it could bring exactly the kind of attention that had destroyed other packs in other territories decades earlier. Kale decided he would see this matter through himself. He gathered no more than a handful of his most trusted wolves and made his way through the darkened forest toward the location Nolan had described. As he moved through the trees with the fluid, silent grace that came from centuries of practice, he turned the strange report over in his mind, searching for some explanation that made sense. Perhaps the woman carried some scent that confused the pack's instincts. Perhaps she was simply fortunate that the wolves who found her happened to be among the gentler members of the group. Whatever the reason, he intended to resolve the situation quickly, and according to the law that had kept his people safe for longer than any human city had stood. When he finally reached the clearing, what he saw stopped him in his tracks. Elena sat calmly on the rock near the stream, and the wolves surrounding her had not moved from their protective formation. As Kale approached, stepping fully into the moonlit clearing in his human form, the wolves turned toward him, and instead of the immediate deference he expected from his own pack, he was met with something that looked remarkably like a warning. The largest wolf, a female named Bryn who had served the pack loyally for years, actually stepped between Kale and Elena, her posture low and tense, a soft growl rumbling in her chest. Kale had never in his life been challenged by his own pack. The shock of it rooted him to the ground for a moment, his mind struggling to process what his instincts told him was happening. He studied Elena more closely now, taking in her travel-worn clothes, the exhaustion etched into her features, the wide, wary eyes that watched him with a mixture of fear and stubborn determination. She did not look like someone capable of threatening an entire pack of ancient wolves. She looked like someone who had been running for her life long before she ever crossed into his territory. He asked Bryn, in the low, commanding tone he used only when addressing his pack directly, why she was defying him. The wolf did not answer in words, because wolves in this form rarely did, but her posture remained unmoved, her body still positioned protectively between the Alpha King and the trembling woman behind her. Cale felt something shift inside his chest, an unfamiliar uncertainty creeping into a mind that had always operated with absolute clarity when it came to matters of pack law and territorial defense. Elena finally found her voice, though it came out quieter and more uncertain than she intended. She told him she meant no harm, that she had not known this land belonged to anyone, that she had only been running from people who wanted to hurt her, and had stumbled into these woods by accident in the middle of the night. She braced herself for anger, for punishment, for whatever fate the old stories had promised trespassers who dared to cross into this forbidden place. Instead, Cale simply stood there, studying her with an intensity that made her skin prickle, his golden eyes reflecting the moonlight in a way that reminded her uncomfortably of the wolves surrounding her. For the first time in longer than he could remember, Cale Ashwood did not know exactly what to do. The law was clear. The law had always been clear, unbending and absolute, a wall he had built with his own hands after losing everything he once trusted, to a betrayal that still haunted the quiet hours of the night. And yet here, in this clearing, his own wolves stood against him, protecting a stranger who by every rule he had ever enforced should have already met the same fate as every other trespasser before her. Something about this woman was different, though he could not yet name what it was, and that uncertainty troubled him more than any direct threat ever could. He made a decision that surprised even himself. Rather than carrying out the sentence the law demanded, he ordered his wolves to escort Elena back to the stronghold, where she would be held under guard, while he determined exactly what force had compelled his pack to defy him so completely. Elena did not resist as gentle hands guided her to her feet, too exhausted and too confused by the surreal turn her night had taken to consider running again. As they walked deeper into the forest, toward a fortress she had not known existed until this very moment, she glanced back once at the wolves, still trailing quietly behind her, and for reasons she could not explain, she felt strangely, impossibly safe. The walk to the stronghold took nearly an hour, winding through paths that seemed to shift and change even as they moved along them, as though the forest itself was alive and rearranging its secrets to keep outsiders forever lost. Elena kept close watch on Cale as they walked, studying the confident, controlled way he moved, the quiet authority in every gesture he made toward the wolves and warriors who fell into step around them. He said nothing to her during the entire journey, his jaw set, his eyes fixed straight ahead, clearly working through some private calculation she could not begin to guess at. She wanted to ask 100 questions, about the wolves, about this place, about what exactly he intended to do with her, now that she was clearly his prisoner rather than his guest. She kept her questions to herself, sensing that now was not the time to test the patience of a man who held her life so completely in his hands. When the stronghold finally came into view, Elena felt her breath catch, despite everything she had already endured that night. It rose out of the forest like something from a story her grandmother might have told her as a child. Dark stone walls climbing 3 stories high, covered in ivy that had clearly been growing undisturbed for decades if not centuries. Torches lined the entrance, their flames casting long shadows that danced across carved wooden doors thick enough to withstand a siege. She had expected, if she expected anything at all, some crude camp hidden in the trees. She had not expected a fortress that spoke of wealth, history, and power, far beyond anything she associated with the wilderness around it. Inside, the warmth of the great hall hit her immediately, a welcome relief after hours spent in the cold night air. A fire blazed in a hearth large enough to stand in, and the walls were lined with tapestries depicting scenes she did not have time to study closely, before Cale directed his people to take her to a chamber on the upper floor. It was not a cell, not exactly, though the heavy door and the guard posted outside made its purpose clear enough. The room itself was surprisingly comfortable, furnished with a soft bed, a wash basin, and a small window that looked out over the dark canopy of the forest below. Elena sat on the edge of the bed once she was alone, her hands trembling now that the adrenaline of the night had finally begun to fade. She thought about the men who had been chasing her, wondering if they had given up at the forest's edge, or if they were still searching somewhere beyond the boundary she had crossed without meaning to. She thought about the wolves who had surrounded her so protectively, an act that made no sense, given everything she had heard about this forest and the man who ruled it. Exhaustion eventually won out over her racing thoughts, and despite the strangeness of her situation, she found herself drifting into a heavy, dreamless sleep before she even realized it was happening. Cale did not sleep at all that night. He sat alone in his study, long after Elena had been settled into her chamber, staring into the flames of his own smaller hearth, replaying the events of the clearing over and over in his mind. He had ruled this territory for over a decade, had built a reputation fierce enough to keep both human and rival pack threats far from his borders, and in all that time, his authority over his own people had never once been questioned. Tonight, that had changed in a matter of moments, and he could not shake the feeling that something larger than simple chance was at work. He called Callum back to his study near dawn, unable to hold his questions any longer. Callum arrived looking as tired as Cale felt, though his loyalty kept any complaint from reaching his lips. Cale asked him directly what he thought had caused Bryn and the others to act as they had, whether he had ever heard of anything like it happening before, in this pack or any other. Callum admitted he had not in all his years serving under Cale's leadership, though he mentioned, almost as an afterthought, old stories his grandmother used to tell about certain bloodlines that carried a scent wolves were bound to protect. Stories he had always assumed were nothing more than folklore meant to entertain children before bed. Cale turned this information over carefully, unwilling to dismiss it outright given everything he had witnessed. He decided that before he made any further decisions about the woman's fate, he needed to understand exactly what had drawn his pack to her so completely. It was not mercy that stayed his hand that night, not entirely, though something in him resisted examining that possibility too closely. It was the simple, undeniable fact that he could not act against his own instincts when every wolf under his command had made their loyalty to this stranger unmistakably clear. Whatever Elena Marsh was, whoever she truly was beneath the exhaustion and fear he had witnessed in that clearing, he intended to find out before the sun rose fully over Blackthorn Forest. As the first gray light of morning began filtering through the tall windows of the stronghold, Cale made his way back up to the chamber where Elena slept, standing outside the door for a long moment, before finally deciding against waking her. There would be time for questions later, time to unravel whatever mystery had followed her across his boundary and turned his own pack against centuries of unbroken law. For now, he simply stood there, listening to the quiet sounds of the forest waking around him, and allowed himself, for the first time since this strange night began, to wonder what exactly he had allowed to walk into his world. Elena woke to sunlight streaming through the small window of her chamber, disoriented for several long seconds, before the memories of the previous night came rushing back to her all at once. She sat up quickly, her heart pounding, as she took in the unfamiliar stone walls, the heavy wooden door, the strange quiet that surrounded her. For a moment she wondered if the entire ordeal had been some fevered dream, brought on by exhaustion and fear, but the ache in her legs and the dried mud still clinging to her boots told her otherwise. She was truly a prisoner, in a fortress deep within a forest that was not supposed to exist on any map she had ever seen. A soft knock at the door startled her before it opened to reveal a young woman carrying a tray of food and fresh water. She introduced herself as Mira, explaining in a gentle, careful voice that she had been asked to see to Elena's needs while she remained a guest in the stronghold. Elena noted the word guest, wondering if it had been chosen deliberately to soften the reality of her situation. She thanked Mira and asked, as casually as she could manage, what exactly was going to happen to her now. Mira's expression flickered with something like sympathy, before she admitted she did not know, that such decisions belonged entirely to the Alpha, and that in all her years living within these walls, she had never once seen him uncertain about how to handle a trespasser. The word trespasser sent a fresh wave of anxiety through Elena's chest, and she pressed Mira for more information, asking what typically happened to people who crossed into this territory. Mira hesitated, clearly torn between her instinct toward discretion and something softer that made her want to offer comfort to a frightened stranger. Eventually she admitted, in a hushed voice, that trespassers were never allowed to leave, that the forest's secrecy depended on strict enforcement of its boundaries. She quickly added, however, that Elena's case was different, that the pack's reaction to her had been unlike anything the stronghold had witnessed in generations, and that this alone seemed to have changed the Alpha's usual approach entirely. Elena absorbed this information slowly, turning it over in her mind as she ate the simple but satisfying meal Mira had brought her. She thought about the wolves in the clearing, the way they had surrounded her not with hostility, but with what had felt, even in her fear, like genuine protection. She thought about the tall, commanding man who had arrived afterward, whose golden eyes had studied her with an intensity that made her feel simultaneously exposed and, strangely, safe. She did not understand any of it, but she understood enough to know that her survival likely depended on staying calm, cooperative, and alert to every opportunity that might present itself in the days ahead. Cale spent that morning in the Stronghold's lower archive, a room few of his people ever entered, filled with records and journals kept by generations of Alphas who had ruled Blackthorn Forest before him. He was searching for any reference to the old stories Callum had mentioned, tales of bloodlines that carried a scent capable of overriding even the strongest pack instincts. The archive was vast, its shelves lined with leather-bound volumes some centuries old, their pages brittle, and their ink faded nearly to illegibility in places. He worked through the morning with the same relentless focus he brought to everything in his life, refusing to leave until he had exhausted every possible source of information. It was well past midday when he finally found something useful, a journal belonging to an Alpha who had ruled the territory nearly 200 years earlier. The entries described a bloodline known among the old packs as Guardians, humans born with an inherited connection to wolves so deep that entire packs would instinctively protect them, regardless of any command given by their Alpha. The journal explained that such bloodlines had grown exceedingly rare over the centuries, their numbers dwindling as human settlements expanded and old magic faded from a world increasingly dominated by steel and stone. According to the entry, the last confirmed Guardian bloodline within Blackthorn territory had vanished nearly a century earlier, believed by most to have died out entirely. Cale read the passage 3 times, his mind racing through the implications. If Elena truly carried this bloodline, it would explain everything he had witnessed in the clearing, the immediate and unshakable loyalty his wolves had shown her, despite every law standing against such behavior. It would also mean that her presence in his forest was no longer simply a matter of enforcing boundaries and protecting secrecy. If word spread that a guardian had reappeared after so long, it could draw attention from every corner of the supernatural world, from rival packs eager to claim such a valuable ally, to darker forces that had hunted guardian bloodlines to near extinction for reasons the old journal did not fully explain. He closed the journal slowly, aware that the situation had grown far more complicated than a simple trespassing case. He needed to speak with Elena directly, to understand where she had come from, who her family was, and why she had ended up running through his forest in the middle of the night, with dangerous men apparently in pursuit. He made his way back through the stronghold, his thoughts still churning, and arrived at her chamber just as Mira was collecting the empty tray from her morning meal. When Cale entered the room, Elena rose to her feet instinctively, unsure whether she should feel afraid or hopeful given his unreadable expression. He studied her for a long moment before speaking, his voice measured and careful in a way that suggested he was choosing his words with great deliberation. He asked her to tell him everything, starting with her name, her family, and the reason she had been running through the darkness the night his wolves found her. Elena hesitated only briefly, before deciding that honesty was likely her best chance at understanding whatever strange situation she had fallen into. She told him her full story, beginning with her childhood in a small coastal town where she had been raised by her grandmother after her parents passed away when she was young. She explained that her grandmother had always spoken of an old family legacy, something she called a duty passed down through generations of women in their family, though she had never explained exactly what that duty entailed before she died 3 years earlier. Elena admitted she had dismissed most of it as harmless superstition until recent weeks, when a group of men had begun watching her house, following her movements, and eventually breaking into her home while she was away, searching for something she did not understand. She described the night she finally realized how serious the danger had become, when she overheard 2 of the men discussing her in terms that made her blood run cold, referring to her as though she were valuable property rather than a person, discussing plans that involved taking her somewhere far from anyone who might help her. She had fled that same night, taking only what she could carry, running without any clear destination in mind, driven entirely by the instinct to put as much distance as possible between herself and the danger closing in around her. She had no idea, she admitted, that her flight would eventually lead her into a forest, guarded by wolves, and ruled by a king, out of old legends. Cale listened to her account without interruption, his expression giving away little of the calculations running through his mind. When she finished, he asked her several careful questions about her grandmother, about any objects or symbols that had been passed down through her family, about any physical markings she might carry, that she had never been able to explain. Elena thought for a moment, before mentioning a small, unusual birthmark on her left shoulder, shaped vaguely like an unfurling leaf, which her grandmother had always treated with peculiar reverence, tracing it gently with her fingers whenever she caught sight of it, and murmuring words in a language Elena had never recognized. This confirmation seemed to settle something in Cale's mind, though he did not immediately share what he had discovered in the archive that morning. Instead, he asked if she would allow him to see the mark, explaining as gently as his usually commanding tone allowed, that it might help him understand why his pack had reacted to her so strongly. Elena agreed, pulling aside the collar of her shirt just enough to reveal the pale, leaf-shaped mark on her shoulder. Cale studied it carefully, and Elena watched something shift in his expression, a flicker of recognition, mixed with what looked almost like relief, though it vanished so quickly, she could not be entirely certain she had seen it at all. He explained to her, finally, what he had learned about the Guardian bloodlines, choosing his words carefully to avoid overwhelming her with information she had no context to understand. He told her that certain human families carried a connection to wolves so deep that it transcended ordinary instinct, an inherited bond that made packs across generations feel compelled to protect them absolutely. He explained that such bloodlines had grown vanishingly rare, and that her arrival, marked as she was, likely explained the otherwise inexplicable behavior of his pack in the clearing the previous night. Elena absorbed this information with wide eyes, her mind struggling to reconcile the strange, almost mystical explanation with the ordinary life she had lived up until a few weeks earlier. She asked him, hesitantly, what this meant for her now, whether it changed anything about her situation within the stronghold. Cale considered the question for a long moment, before answering honestly that he was not entirely certain himself. The law of his territory demanded that trespassers be dealt with severely, a rule that had protected his pack's existence for generations. But he could not, in good conscience, act against a bloodline his own people were instinctively bound to protect, not when doing so risked tearing apart the loyalty and trust that held his pack together. He told her that for now, she would remain within the stronghold under careful watch, not as a prisoner exactly, but not entirely free either, while he determined the safest course forward for everyone involved. Elena found herself surprised by the honesty in his answer, having expected either harsh dismissal or empty reassurance rather than this careful, measured acknowledgement of his own uncertainty. She studied him for a moment, noting the tension in his shoulders, the way his jaw tightened slightly as he spoke, small signs of a man carrying far more weight and responsibility than his commanding presence initially suggested. She found herself, against every instinct toward caution she had developed over the past terrifying weeks, beginning to trust him, at least enough to believe that he did not intend to harm her. Over the following days, a strange rhythm settled over the stronghold. Elena remained within its walls, though Cale gradually allowed her more freedom to move through the common areas rather than remaining confined to her chamber. She began to recognize faces among the pack, learning names slowly, as various members went about their daily routines around her. Mira remained a constant, gentle presence, clearly assigned to keep watch over her but doing so with genuine warmth that made the arrangement feel less like surveillance and more like unexpected friendship. Callum, too, spent time observing her from a respectful distance, his sharp eyes missing nothing, though he treated her with a courtesy that suggested he had accepted his alpha's decision to keep her close, at least for now. Elena noticed, too, how the wolves continued to gravitate toward her whenever she moved through the stronghold's grounds, a quiet, constant presence that no longer frightened her the way it had that first terrifying night in the clearing. Bryn in particular seemed to have appointed herself as a kind of personal guardian, often found resting near whatever room Elena occupied, her large, dark form somehow comforting rather than threatening now that Elena understood the protective instinct driving such behavior. She began, slowly, to feel less like a trapped animal and more like someone who had stumbled, however unexpectedly, into a place where she might actually be safe. Cale, meanwhile, found himself increasingly drawn to observe Elena during the quiet moments when his duties allowed it, telling himself each time that his interest was purely a matter of understanding the unusual situation her presence had created. He watched the way she moved through the stronghold with growing confidence, the careful curiosity in her expression as she studied the tapestries and carvings that told the history of his people, the quiet kindness she showed toward Mira and the other members of his pack who crossed her path. He found himself, against every instinct toward guarded distance he had cultivated over years of difficult leadership, curious about her, in ways that unsettled him more than he wanted to admit. One evening, as the sun began to set and cast long shadows across the stronghold's inner courtyard, Cale found Elena sitting alone near a small garden that had been cultivated within the fortress walls, tending carefully to a patch of wildflowers that had somehow survived despite the forest's deep shade. He approached slowly, and she looked up at him with an expression that held less fear than it had during their previous conversations, replaced instead by a cautious curiosity that mirrored his own. He sat down across from her without quite deciding to do so, and for a while, neither of them spoke, content simply to share the quiet stillness of the evening. Eventually, Elena broke the silence, asking him quietly about the scars she had noticed along his forearm, faint, but clearly visible in the fading light. Cale's expression darkened slightly, and for a moment, she worried she had overstepped some unspoken boundary. But then he answered, his voice quieter than she had heard it before, explaining that they were reminders of a betrayal years earlier, one that had cost him people he had trusted completely, and had shaped the harsh laws he now enforced without exception. He did not elaborate further, and Elena did not push him to, sensing that some wounds needed time and trust before they could be fully shared. But something had shifted between them in that quiet exchange, a small thread of understanding, woven between two people who had both learned, in different ways, what it meant to lose everything, and be forced to rebuild from nothing. As the days continued to pass, Elena began to notice something else as well, a growing tension among certain members of the pack, whenever conversations turned toward her presence within the stronghold. Rurik, a broad-shouldered man who served as one of Cale's senior advisors, watched her with an expression she could not quite read, something colder and more calculating than the curiosity or acceptance she saw in most others around her. She mentioned this observation to Mira one afternoon, who grew unusually quiet before admitting that Rurik had never been fully comfortable with any deviation from the pack's traditional laws, and that Elena's continued presence within the stronghold had clearly unsettled him more than he expressed openly. Elena filed this information away carefully, sensing, even as her trust in Cale and much of his pack continued to grow, that not everyone within these walls welcomed her arrival, and that the true test of her safety here had likely not yet begun. 2 weeks passed since Elena had first crossed into Blackthorn Forest, and though she had not forgotten the danger that first drove her into the trees, she found herself settling into a strange new rhythm within the stronghold's walls. She woke each morning to the sound of birds calling from the forest canopy, ate breakfast with Mira in the kitchen rather than alone in her chamber, and spent her afternoons exploring whatever parts of the fortress Cale permitted, always trailed at a respectful distance by Bryn, or one of the other wolves who had claimed her as their responsibility. It was not freedom exactly, but it was far more than she had expected when she first stumbled, terrified and exhausted, into this place. Cale found himself seeking her company more often than he had anticipated when he first decided to keep her within the stronghold. He told himself repeatedly that his visits were necessary, part of his ongoing effort to understand the Guardian bloodline and what her presence might mean for his pack's future. But as the days passed, he could no longer fully convince himself that duty alone explained the way he sought her out during quiet moments, or the small, unfamiliar warmth that settled in his chest whenever she smiled at something he said. He had not allowed himself such feelings in a very long time, not since the betrayal that had cost him so much, and the return of them now unsettled him in ways he struggled to name even in the privacy of his own thoughts. One afternoon, as autumn began to color the edges of the forest canopy visible from the stronghold's highest windows, Cale invited Elena to walk with him through a section of the grounds she had not yet seen, a quiet path that wound past an old training yard where members of the pack practiced hand-to-hand combat and honed the discipline that kept their territory secure. Elena watched with fascination as several warriors sparred in the yard, their movements swift and precise, clearly the product of years of dedicated training. She asked Kale about the purpose behind such rigorous discipline, and he explained, his tone growing more serious, that Blackthorn Forest did not exist in isolation, that rival packs and other dangers lurked beyond its borders, always testing for weakness, always searching for any opportunity to challenge his authority or claim territory that had belonged to his people for generations. Elena absorbed this explanation with growing understanding of just how precarious the peace within these walls truly was. She had assumed, perhaps naively, that the greatest danger she faced now came from the men who had chased her from her old life, but Kale's words reminded her that the world he inhabited carried its own complex web of threats, alliances, and rivalries that existed entirely separate from the ordinary human concerns she had grown up understanding. She found herself curious about this hidden world, asking careful questions about the other packs that bordered his territory, about the delicate balance of power that kept an uneasy peace among them. Kale answered her questions with more openness than he had shown anyone outside his closest circle in years, explaining that the nearest rival pack, led by an alpha named Edwin Voss, had long harbored ambitions of expanding their territory into Blackthorn Forest, testing the boundaries every few months with small incursions that never quite crossed the line into open conflict. He explained that maintaining strength and consistency in enforcing his territorial laws was not simply about pride or tradition, but a necessary deterrent against packs like Edwin's, who would seize upon any sign of weakness as an invitation to attack. Elena began to understand, listening to him speak, just how much responsibility rested on his shoulders, and how the harsh reputation he had built over the years served a purpose far more complex than simple cruelty. As they continued their walk, Elena noticed Rurik watching them from across the training yard, his expression unreadable, but his attention clearly fixed on their conversation. She mentioned this to Kale quietly, and his jaw tightened slightly as he glanced in Rurik's direction. He explained, choosing his words carefully, that Rurik had served as one of his most trusted advisors for many years, a man whose loyalty had never wavered, even through the darkest periods of Kale's leadership. But he admitted, with some reluctance, that Rurik held firm beliefs about the importance of tradition and law, beliefs that made him deeply uncomfortable with any exception made to the rules that had governed their territory for generations. Elena asked if this meant Rurik saw her as a threat, and Kale did not answer immediately, his silence answering the question more clearly than words might have. That evening, Kale called a meeting of his senior advisors, gathering them in the Great Hall to discuss, at last, the full implications of Elena's presence within the stronghold. Rurik arrived early, taking his usual seat near the head of the long wooden table, his posture stiff and formal in a way that suggested he had already anticipated the direction this conversation would take. Callum sat nearby, his expression carefully neutral, though Elena, watching from a doorway she had not been explicitly invited to but had not been turned away from either, could see the quiet support in the way he glanced occasionally toward his alpha. Kale explained to the gathered advisors what he had learned about Elena's bloodline, laying out the historical records he had found in the archive, and the significance such a discovery held for their pack's future. He acknowledged openly that keeping her within the stronghold represented a departure from established law, but argued that the pack's own instinctive protection of her left him little choice, that acting against such a deeply rooted bond risked fracturing the very loyalty and trust that held their community together. Several advisors nodded slowly as he spoke, clearly persuaded by the weight of tradition and precedent he cited from the ancient journals. Rurik, however, remained unconvinced, and when Kale finished speaking, he rose from his seat to voice his concerns directly, his tone respectful but firm. He argued that exceptions to their laws, however well-intentioned, created dangerous precedents that could be exploited by enemies or misused by future leaders, less careful than Kale himself. He raised concerns about the risks of her presence becoming known beyond their borders, about the attention a confirmed guardian bloodline might draw from packs and other forces far more dangerous than Edwin Voss and his territorial ambitions. He did not call for Elena's immediate removal, but his warnings carried a weight that settled uncomfortably over the room, and Elena, listening from the doorway, felt a fresh wave of uncertainty about her place within this world she had so unexpectedly entered. Kale listened to Rurik's concerns with the patience of a leader who valued honest counsel, even when it challenged his own instincts. But when he finally responded, his voice carried an unmistakable finality. He acknowledged the risks Rurik outlined, but stated clearly that he would not act against a bond his own pack had chosen to honor, that Elena would remain under his protection, until he determined with certainty what her presence meant for their future. The meeting ended shortly after, the advisors dispersing with varying expressions of acceptance or lingering doubt, and Elena stepped back from the doorway before anyone noticed she had been listening, her mind racing with everything she had just overheard. She found Kale alone later that night, standing on a balcony that overlooked the darkened forest, his expression heavy with the weight of decisions she now understood carried far greater consequences than she had initially realized. She approached quietly, and he acknowledged her presence with a small, tired smile, before returning his gaze to the trees below. She asked him honestly whether keeping her here put his position, and his pack, at genuine risk. He considered the question for a long moment before answering that every decision a leader made carried risk, but that some risks were worth taking when the alternative meant abandoning something, or someone, that deserved protection. Elena felt something warm settle in her chest at his words, a feeling she recognized, with some reluctance, as more than simple gratitude. She had spent weeks running from danger, from people who saw her only as something to be captured and controlled, and here, in this unlikely place surrounded by wolves and ancient laws, she had found someone willing to risk his own authority to ensure her safety. She did not fully understand yet what that meant for either of them, but she found herself, standing beside him on that quiet balcony, unwilling to imagine returning to the life she had fled before all of this began. Over the following days, Elena noticed subtle changes in how the pack treated her, a growing warmth from many members who had initially kept a cautious distance, balanced against the continued cold reserve she felt whenever Rurik happened to cross her path. She spent time with Mira learning about pack customs and history, discovering a rich culture built around loyalty, family, and a deep connection to the natural world that she found herself increasingly drawn to understand more fully. She also spent time with Callum, who, once he had accepted his alpha's decision, proved surprisingly good company, sharing stories about the pack's history and offering practical advice about navigating the complex social dynamics of the stronghold. Through it all, her bond with Kale continued to deepen, in ways neither of them fully acknowledged aloud. They took to sharing meals together in the evenings, conversations stretching late into the night as they exchanged stories about their pasts, their losses, the paths that had led them each to this unlikely meeting point in the depths of Blackthorn Forest. Elena learned more about the betrayal that had scarred him years earlier, a former friend and pack member who had sold information to a rival alpha, leading to an attack that had cost Kale several people he loved deeply before he ever assumed full leadership of the pack. Kale, in turn, learned about the grandmother who had raised Elena, the quiet dignity and strength that had shaped Elena's own character, despite the losses she had endured throughout her life. One night, as a storm rolled through the forest and rain hammered against the stronghold's stone walls, Elena found herself unable to sleep, unsettled by the howling wind and the flashes of lightning that briefly illuminated her chamber. She made her way quietly through the darkened halls, drawn by some instinct toward the great hall, where a fire still burned low in the hearth. She found Kale there, sitting alone, staring into the flames with an expression of deep contemplation. He looked up when she entered, and something passed between them in that quiet, storm-lit moment, an understanding that neither of them needed words to express. She sat beside him near the fire, and for a long while they simply watched the flames together in comfortable silence, the storm raging outside, doing nothing to disturb the calm that had settled between them. Eventually, Kale spoke, his voice quieter than she had ever heard it, admitting that he had not expected, when his scouts first reported an intruder crossing the eastern boundary, that his entire understanding of duty, tradition, and even his own heart would be so thoroughly challenged by one frightened woman stumbling through his forest in the dark. Elena felt tears prick unexpectedly at her eyes, moved by the vulnerability in his admission, and she reached out, without fully deciding to, and rested her hand gently over his. Neither of them spoke further that night, content to simply sit together as the storm gradually passed and the fire burned down to quiet embers. But something had shifted permanently in that shared silence. A bond formed not through the ancient instincts of his pack, but through their own choice, their own growing trust and affection, built slowly across the strange and unexpected weeks since Elena had first crossed into this forbidden forest. Neither of them yet knew what challenges still lay ahead, what dangers Rurik's warnings had rightly anticipated, but for that one quiet night, wrapped in the warmth of the fire and the comfort of unspoken understanding, both of them allowed themselves to simply feel safe. The peace that had settled over the stronghold in recent weeks shattered early one morning when a scout burst into the great hall during breakfast, his face pale and his breathing ragged from running the entire distance from the northern border. He reported that a group of warriors from Edwin Voss's territory had crossed nearly a mile into Blackthorn Forest overnight, marking trees with their scent in a deliberate and unmistakable challenge to Kale's authority. This was no accidental wandering or careless mistake. It was a calculated test, and everyone in the hall understood immediately what it meant. Kale rose from the table without hesitation, his entire demeanor transforming in an instant, from the relaxed warmth Elena had grown accustomed to over recent weeks, into something harder, more commanding, the Alpha King the old stories had described. He issued orders rapidly to Callum and the other warriors present, organizing a response team to investigate the incursion and reinforce the northern boundary. Elena watched this transformation with a mixture of fascination and unease, seeing for the first time the full weight of authority and capability that had allowed him to protect this territory for so many years. She asked, once the immediate flurry of preparation had settled slightly, whether this meant open conflict was coming. Kale's expression remained grim as he explained that Edwin Voss had grown increasingly bold in recent months, likely sensing an opportunity in whatever rumors had begun circulating about unusual activity within the Blackthorn stronghold. He admitted, with some reluctance, that word of Elena's presence had likely reached beyond their borders despite every effort to maintain secrecy, and that rival packs would naturally interpret any perceived distraction or division within his leadership as weakness worth exploiting. Elena felt a fresh wave of guilt settle over her, wondering if her presence had inadvertently placed the entire pack in greater danger than they would otherwise have faced. She voiced this concern to Kale as he prepared to depart for the northern border himself, but he stopped what he was doing and turned to face her fully, his expression softening slightly, despite the tension of the moment. He told her firmly that Edwin Voss had tested his borders long before she ever arrived, that ambitious rivals required no excuse to probe for weakness, and that she bore no responsibility for choices made by people determined to see opportunity in any circumstance available to them. Despite his reassurance, Elena could not fully shake her worry as she watched him depart with a contingent of warriors, disappearing into the tree line with a speed and purpose that reminded her again of the wolf that lived within him, always present even in his human form. She spent the following hours in a state of nervous distraction, unable to focus on anything productive as she waited for news from the northern border. Mira stayed close by her side throughout the day, offering quiet company and gentle reassurance, though even her calm presence could not fully ease the anxious tension that had settled over the entire stronghold. News finally arrived late in the afternoon, carried by a messenger who reported that Kale's forces had successfully driven back Edwin's warriors without serious conflict, though tensions along the border remained high, and further incursions seemed likely in the coming days. Elena felt relief wash over her at the news that no one had been seriously harmed, but the messenger's warning about continued tension left little room for lasting comfort. She waited anxiously for Kale's return, watching the courtyard from her chamber window until she finally saw him emerge from the tree line as evening shadows lengthened across the stronghold grounds. She met him in the entrance hall as soon as he arrived, relief evident on her face as she took in the sight of him, tired but clearly unharmed. He looked surprised and then quietly pleased by the obvious concern she had carried for him throughout the day, and for a moment, standing there in the flickering torchlight, neither of them spoke, simply relieved to see the other safe after a day filled with uncertainty. Eventually, he explained what had happened at the border, describing how his warriors had confronted Edwin's scouts and successfully pushed them back across the boundary line without bloodshed, though he acknowledged that such restraint would likely need to give way to firmer action if the incursions continued. Over dinner that evening, Kale explained more fully the history between his pack and Edwin Voss's territory, a rivalry that stretched back decades, rooted in disputes over land, resources, and old grievances that had never been fully resolved. He described Edwin as a capable but deeply ambitious leader, someone who had spent years searching for any advantage that might allow him to expand his territory at Blackthorn's expense. Elena listened carefully, beginning to understand the complex political landscape that Cale navigated constantly, a landscape she had known nothing about when she first stumbled into his forest weeks earlier. She asked him, hesitantly, what would happen if Edwin discovered the truth about her presence within the stronghold, about the guardian bloodline that had caused his own pack to defy centuries of established law. Cale's expression grew serious as he considered the question, admitting that such knowledge would likely embolden Edwin significantly, giving him a pretext to justify more aggressive action against Blackthorn territory under the guise of protecting the broader pack community from whatever danger he might claim her presence represented. He assured her, however, that he would do everything within his power to protect both her and his people, regardless of whatever challenges Edwin's ambitions might create. In the days that followed, the stronghold shifted into a heightened state of readiness, warriors training with renewed intensity, scouts patrolling the borders with greater frequency, and an undercurrent of tension running through conversations that had grown lighter and more relaxed in the weeks before the incursion. Elena found herself drawn increasingly into these preparations, offering what help she could, learning basic self-defense techniques from Callum during quiet afternoons, and spending time in the archive alongside Cale as they continued researching the Guardian bloodlines for any additional information that might prove useful in the challenges ahead. Rurik, throughout this period of heightened tension, grew increasingly vocal in his concerns, arguing openly in advisory meetings that Elena's presence represented an unnecessary complication during a time when the pack needed absolute unity and focus. Cale continued to defend his decision, but Elena noticed the toll these constant disagreements took on him, the weariness that crept into his expression during quiet moments when he believed no one was watching. She began to wonder, with growing unease, whether her continued presence within the stronghold was truly the right choice, whether her safety was worth the strain it placed on Cale's leadership and the unity of his pack. She raised this concern with him one evening as they walked together through the training yard, now empty as darkness settled over the grounds. She suggested, carefully, that perhaps it would be better for everyone if she found somewhere else to go, some way to disappear from both the dangers pursuing her from her old life and the political complications her presence had introduced within his territory. Cale stopped walking abruptly, turning to face her with an intensity that startled her, and told her firmly that he had no intention of allowing her to leave, not while dangerous people still hunted her beyond the forest's boundaries, and not, he admitted more quietly, because he had grown to care for her in ways that went far beyond his responsibility as a leader protecting a member of a rare bloodline. Elena felt her breath catch at his admission, searching his expression for any sign of hesitation or doubt, finding instead only quiet, steady certainty. She admitted, in turn, that she had grown to care for him as well, that despite the danger and uncertainty that had defined every day since she crossed into his forest, she had found something within these walls she had not expected to find anywhere, a sense of belonging and safety that went beyond simple gratitude for his protection. The tension of the day's political concerns faded, if only briefly, as they stood together in the quiet training yard, the weight of their shared feelings finally acknowledged openly between them for the first time. Their moment of quiet connection was interrupted by the arrival of Nolan, breathless from running, who reported that another incursion had been spotted along the eastern boundary, smaller than the previous one but concerning nonetheless, given how quickly it had followed the first challenge. Cale's expression hardened immediately, the warmth of the previous moment giving way once again to the focused intensity of a leader responding to threats against his territory. He instructed Nolan to gather a response team while he escorted Elena back to the safety of the stronghold, promising to return as soon as the situation had been addressed. As she watched him depart once again into the darkness, Elena felt the familiar knot of worry tighten in her chest. But beneath that worry, now sat something new, a quiet determination to find some way to help ease the burden Edwin Voss's ambitions had placed on the man she had come to care for so deeply. She resolved, standing alone in the torchlit courtyard, that she would not simply remain a passive presence within these walls, waiting anxiously for news of danger she felt at least partially responsible for bringing to this place. Whatever the coming days held, she intended to find some way to stand alongside Cale and his pack, rather than remaining merely a burden they felt obligated to protect. In the days following the second border incursion, Elena found herself increasingly troubled by fragments of memory that surfaced unexpectedly, small details from the weeks before she fled her old life that she had not fully examined in the chaos of her escape. She remembered, with growing clarity, a conversation she had overheard between two of the men who had been watching her house, a conversation that had seemed strange even at the time, but that she had dismissed in the urgency of her flight. They had mentioned a name, spoken with obvious deference, someone they answered to who had specifically instructed them to locate her without drawing unnecessary attention. She mentioned this memory to Cale one evening as they sat together in his study, surrounded by the ancient journals and records he continued to consult in his ongoing research into the Guardian bloodlines. He listened carefully as she tried to recall the exact name the men had used, her brow furrowed with concentration as she reached back through weeks of fear and exhaustion to pull the detail forward with certainty. Eventually she remembered it clearly, a name that meant nothing to her, but that caused Cale's expression to shift immediately into something sharp and alert. He asked her to repeat the name again, and when she did, he rose from his chair and moved quickly to a shelf, where he retrieved another journal, this one more recent than the historical records he had been studying, filled with notes he had compiled himself over the years, regarding threats and rivals beyond his immediate territory. He searched through the pages quickly, and Elena watched his expression grow increasingly grim as he found what he was looking for. He explained that the name she had remembered belonged to a broker of sorts, someone who operated in the shadowy spaces between the human world and the hidden supernatural community, known for locating and selling information about rare individuals to whoever offered the highest price. This revelation sent a chill through Elena that had nothing to do with the cool evening air drifting through the study's open window. She had assumed, throughout her entire ordeal, that the men chasing her were simply criminals interested in whatever they believed she possessed, some misguided assumption about wealth or connections her family might have hidden away. The idea that she had been specifically targeted because of her bloodline, that her pursuit had been orchestrated by someone deeply embedded in the same hidden world Cale inhabited, reframed everything she thought she understood about the danger she had fled. Cale explained further, his voice tight with barely controlled anger, that this broker had a known history of working with rival packs and other supernatural factions interested in acquiring Guardian bloodlines for their own purposes, whether to secure protective loyalty for themselves or to eliminate potential threats to their ambitions before those threats could fully manifest. He admitted that this new information raised deeply troubling questions about whether Elena's arrival in his forest had truly been the accident she believed it to be, or whether some larger design had guided her, whether unknowingly or not, directly into his territory. Elena felt overwhelmed by this possibility, struggling to reconcile the terrifying, chaotic flight she remembered so vividly with the idea that some calculated plan might have guided her steps all along. She asked Cale directly whether he believed she had been deliberately steered toward Blackthorn Forest, and he admitted, after a long moment of careful consideration, that he could not yet be certain, but that the timing and circumstances raised questions too significant to ignore. He promised her that he would investigate further, reaching out to contacts he trusted within the broader supernatural community to gather more information about the broker's activities and intentions. Over the following days, Cale dedicated significant time to this investigation, corresponding with allies in distant territories, calling in favors accumulated over years of careful diplomacy, searching for any information that might explain the true nature of the threat surrounding Elena. Elena, meanwhile, found herself increasingly restless, unable to simply wait passively while others worked to unravel the mystery surrounding her own life. She began spending more time in the archive herself, poring through old records alongside Cale, searching for any additional information about Guardian bloodlines that might help her understand the legacy her grandmother had never fully explained before her death. During one such research session, Elena came across a passage that caught her attention immediately, a brief mention of a specific Guardian bloodline that had once been closely tied to Blackthorn territory itself, generations before Cale's own leadership began. The passage described a young woman from this bloodline who had formed a deep bond with the Alpha of that era, a bond that had ultimately strengthened the Pack's territory and secured decades of peace and prosperity for the entire community. Elena read the passage aloud to Cale, and she noticed him grow quiet, clearly moved by the parallel between this historical account and their own unfolding situation. He admitted, after a thoughtful pause, that he had wondered whether their own bond, formed so unexpectedly across the weeks since her arrival, might carry similar significance for the future of his territory, though he was careful to clarify that his feelings for her extended far beyond any strategic consideration of pack benefit. Elena felt warmth spread through her chest at this admission, understanding that whatever larger forces might have played a role in bringing her to this forest, the connection that had grown between them belonged entirely to their own choices, their own genuine affection developed through weeks of shared experience and honest conversation. Their research was interrupted late one afternoon by the arrival of a raven, a messenger bird, trained by allies in a distant territory to carry sensitive correspondence beyond the reach of ordinary communication methods. Kale read the message quickly, his expression shifting through several emotions, before settling into something that looked like grim understanding. He explained to Elena that his contacts had confirmed the broker's involvement in her pursuit, and more troublingly, had discovered evidence suggesting the broker maintained connections to Edwin Voss's territory, connections that suggested a possible coordination between the rival Alpha's territorial ambitions and the forces that had originally driven Elena into Blackthorn Forest. This revelation reframed the entire situation in a way that left both of them deeply unsettled. If Edwin Voss had indeed coordinated in some fashion with the broker who orchestrated Elena's pursuit, it suggested a level of premeditation and strategic planning far beyond simple opportunistic border testing. It raised the possibility that Elena's arrival in Blackthorn Forest, and the subsequent strain it placed on Kale's leadership and pack unity, had been anticipated, perhaps even deliberately engineered, as part of a larger scheme to weaken Blackthorn territory from within, before Edwin's forces attempted a more significant challenge to its borders. Kale called an emergency meeting of his senior advisors that evening, sharing this new information with the same gathering that had previously debated Elena's presence within the stronghold. Rurik listened to the revelations with an expression that Elena found difficult to fully interpret, a mixture of vindication regarding his earlier warnings and genuine concern about the implications for the pack's security. Callum, meanwhile, immediately began strategizing about how to strengthen their defenses, given this new understanding of the coordinated threat they now faced. As the meeting continued late into the night, Elena found herself once again positioned at the periphery of decisions that would shape her own fate as much as the future of Kale's entire pack. She listened as the advisors debated various strategies, from strengthening border patrols to reaching out to other allied packs for support against Edwin's growing ambitions. Through it all, she felt a quiet but growing resolve settling within her, a determination that she would not simply remain a passive figure whose presence created danger for others to manage, but would find some meaningful way to contribute to whatever conflict lay ahead. Late that night, after the advisors had finally dispersed to their own quarters and the stronghold had settled into a tense, uneasy quiet, Elena found Kale alone in his study once more, staring at the map of his territory spread across his desk, marked with symbols indicating the various threats and vulnerabilities they now needed to address. She approached quietly and asked him what she could do to help, refusing to accept his initial insistence that her safety remained his only priority regarding her role in the coming conflict. She reminded him, gently but firmly, that she was not merely a bloodline to be protected, but a person capable of making her own choices about the risks she was willing to accept. Kale studied her for a long moment, clearly torn between his protective instincts and his growing respect for her determination and courage. Eventually he relented, agreeing to include her in strategic discussions moving forward, though he insisted that her physical safety would remain a firm priority, regardless of whatever role she chose to play in the unfolding conflict. Elena accepted this compromise, grateful for his willingness to see her as a genuine partner, rather than simply a responsibility to be managed. As they stood together over the map, the weight of the coming challenges heavy between them. Both of them understood that whatever happened next, they would face it together, bound not merely by ancient instinct, but by a connection they had each chosen freely, deliberately, and completely. With the threat from Edwin Voss's territory now understood in its full complexity, Kale shifted much of his attention towards strengthening Blackthorn's defenses and securing support from allied packs who had maintained friendly relations with his territory over the years. He sent messengers to 3 neighboring alphas he trusted, explaining the situation in careful detail and requesting their assistance should Edwin's ambitions escalate into open conflict. Elena watched this diplomatic effort unfold with growing admiration for the careful, measured way Cale approached even the most stressful circumstances, balancing firmness with genuine respect for the relationships he had cultivated over years of careful leadership. She found herself increasingly involved in these preparations, offering insights from her own experience that proved unexpectedly valuable. Having spent weeks evading the men who pursued her before reaching Blackthorn Forest, she understood something about the patient, methodical way such coordinated threats operated, knowledge that helped Callum and his warriors anticipate certain patterns in how Edwin's forces might attempt to test or breach their borders. Cale noticed this contribution with evident pride, and Elena felt a quiet satisfaction in knowing that her presence within the stronghold had shifted from a source of vulnerability into a genuine asset for the pack's collective security. Rurik's attitude toward her, while still guarded, began to shift subtly during this period as well. He observed her growing usefulness during strategy sessions, her willingness to accept difficult truths about the danger her presence had introduced, and her genuine commitment to helping protect the pack, rather than simply relying on their protection of her. One afternoon, as they found themselves alone briefly in the archive, he approached her directly, acknowledging with obvious reluctance that he had perhaps judged her too harshly during her first weeks within the stronghold. Elena accepted this near apology graciously, understanding that his initial caution had stemmed from genuine concern for his pack's safety, rather than any personal animosity toward her specifically. Despite this apparent thaw in his attitude, Elena continued to notice small inconsistencies in Rurik's behavior that troubled her, though she could not identify anything concrete enough to raise as a genuine concern. She mentioned her unease to Mira one evening, who admitted that she too had noticed Rurik spending unusual amounts of time away from the stronghold in recent days, claiming various reasons related to border patrols and diplomatic outreach that did not always align neatly with the schedules Callum maintained for such activities. Neither of them could point to anything definitively suspicious, but the accumulated weight of small observations left Elena feeling that something beneath the surface of the stronghold's renewed unity remained unresolved. She decided, after much consideration, to share these concerns with Cale directly, choosing a quiet evening when they sat together in his study, reviewing the latest reports from their border patrols. He listened carefully to her observations, his expression growing thoughtful, as she described the pattern of small inconsistencies she and Mira had both noticed. He acknowledged that Rurik's history of loyalty to the pack ran deep, stretching back to his own father's leadership, but admitted that even long-trusted advisors could be swayed by fear, ambition, or circumstances that outsiders rarely fully understood. He promised to observe Rurik more carefully himself, without directly confronting him in a way that might damage trust unnecessarily if her concerns proved unfounded. In the meantime, life within the stronghold continued to find moments of genuine warmth, despite the underlying tension of preparing for potential conflict. Elena's relationship with Cale deepened steadily during this period, their shared responsibilities creating opportunities for connection that went beyond the quiet evening conversations that had first drawn them together. She found herself increasingly comfortable within the rhythms of pack life, forming genuine friendships with Mira and several other members of the community who had initially approached her with understandable caution, but had gradually come to accept her presence as a natural part of the stronghold's daily life. One particularly memorable evening, Cale organized a small gathering to celebrate the successful conclusion of negotiations with one of the allied packs, whose alpha had agreed to provide reinforcements should Edwin's forces attempt any significant incursion into Blackthorn territory. The great hall filled with warmth and laughter that felt like a welcome reprieve from the tension of recent weeks, and Elena found herself dancing, somewhat clumsily, with several members of the pack who had taken it upon themselves to teach her traditional steps, passed down through generations of their community. Cale watched from across the hall with an expression of quiet joy that Elena caught more than once throughout the evening, and when he finally joined her for a dance of their own, the warmth in his eyes left her breathless, in a way that had nothing to do with the physical exertion of the dance itself. Later that night, as the celebration wound down and most of the pack retired to their quarters, Cale and Elena found themselves alone in the quiet courtyard, the same garden where they had first begun to build genuine trust between them weeks earlier. He spoke to her plainly, without the careful diplomatic language he often used when discussing pack matters, telling her that regardless of whatever challenges lay ahead, with Edwin Voss, or the broker who had originally set these events in motion, he did not regret for a single moment the choice he had made that first night in the clearing, to defy centuries of established law, in order to protect her. Elena felt tears gather in her eyes at his sincerity, and she told him in turn that she had never imagined finding a place, or a person, that felt as genuinely like home as Blackthorn Forest and its Alpha King had come to feel for her. Their quiet moment was interrupted, not by any external threat this time, but by the simple arrival of dawn breaking over the eastern tree line, reminding them both that the responsibilities of the coming day awaited, regardless of how much they might wish to remain suspended in that peaceful moment together. Cale walked her back to her chamber, and at the door, he paused, studying her face carefully in the pale morning light, before finally speaking words he had clearly been considering for some time. He told her that he intended, once the current threats to his territory had been fully resolved, to formally acknowledge their bond before his entire pack, to claim her not merely as someone under his protection, but as his equal and his mate, should she be willing to accept such a commitment. Elena felt overwhelmed by the depth of feeling behind his words, understanding fully the significance of what he was proposing within the context of pack tradition and law. She told him honestly that she needed no further time to consider her answer, that her feelings for him had grown certain and unwavering across the weeks they had shared together, and that she would gladly accept whatever bond he wished to formalize between them, once the shadow of Edwin Voss and the broker's schemes no longer hung over their future. They parted with a promise unspoken but clearly understood between them, a commitment to face whatever challenges remained together, before finally allowing themselves to fully claim the happiness that had grown so unexpectedly between them. The following days brought renewed reports from the border, confirming that Edwin's forces continued to probe Blackthorn's boundaries with small, calculated incursions designed to test response times and troop movements rather than provoke immediate conflict. Cale grew increasingly convinced that a larger, more decisive confrontation was inevitable, and he intensified preparations accordingly, training his warriors with renewed urgency and finalizing agreements with the allied packs who had pledged their support. Elena continued to assist wherever she could, though she noticed Cale grew more protective of her physical safety as the likelihood of open conflict increased, a tension between his desire to include her fully in pack matters and his instinct to shield her from direct danger. Throughout this period of intensifying preparation, Rurik's behavior continued to raise quiet questions in Elena's mind, though nothing concrete enough to justify open confrontation. She noticed him engaged in a hushed conversation with an unfamiliar messenger near the stronghold's western gate one evening, a conversation that ended abruptly when he noticed her watching from a nearby window. When she mentioned this observation to Cale later that night, his expression grew troubled, and he admitted that he too had begun noticing small signs that left him uncertain about where Rurik's true loyalties currently stood, despite decades of previously unquestioned service to the pack. He decided, after careful consideration, that he would need to confront Rurik directly, though he wanted to gather more concrete evidence before doing so, in a way that might unnecessarily damage trust or create division within his leadership, if his concerns proved unfounded. He asked Callum to quietly monitor Rurik's movements and communications over the following days, a request Callum accepted with obvious reluctance given his long friendship with the senior advisor, but with an understanding that the pack's security had to take precedence over personal loyalties when genuine questions of betrayal arose. Elena watched this careful, methodical approach to a deeply uncomfortable situation with growing admiration for Cale's leadership, understanding more fully, with each passing day, the immense weight of responsibility he carried in balancing trust, security, and the well-being of everyone who depended on his judgment. The confrontation Cale had anticipated arrived sooner than expected, when scouts reported a significant gathering of Edwin Voss's warriors, massing near the northern boundary, far larger than any previous incursion the pack had witnessed in recent months. Cale received the news early in the morning, and within minutes, the entire stronghold shifted into full readiness, warriors gathering their weapons and taking positions along the routes that led toward the threatened border. Elena watched the transformation with a tightness in her chest, understanding that whatever careful diplomacy and patient preparation had characterized the previous weeks had now given way to the immediate reality of impending conflict. Cale found her briefly before departing to lead his warriors toward the border, his expression a careful mixture of the fierce determination required for what lay ahead, and the softer concern he could not fully suppress when looking at her. He instructed her firmly to remain within the stronghold's most secure chambers, alongside Mira and several trusted guards, explaining that her safety remained his absolute priority, regardless of whatever assistance she might wish to offer during the conflict itself. Elena wanted to argue, wanted to insist on some more active role in defending the home and people she had come to love so deeply, but she recognized the wisdom in his instruction and reluctantly agreed, understanding that adding to his worry during such a critical moment would serve no one well. Before he left, Cale pulled her close for a brief, urgent embrace, promising that he would return to her once the immediate threat had been addressed. Elena held on to that promise as she watched him depart with Callum and a substantial contingent of warriors, disappearing into the tree line with the same fluid, purposeful speed she had witnessed during the earlier border incursions, though this time carrying far greater weight, given the scale of the threat they now faced. She retreated to the secure chamber Cale had designated, joined by Mira and several other members of the pack, not directly involved in the frontline defense, and settled in for what promised to be a long and anxious wait. The hours that followed tested Elena's patience and composure in ways she had not fully anticipated. She paced the confined space of the chamber, unable to focus on any of the activities Mira suggested to help pass the time, her mind constantly returning to Cale and the warriors who had departed to face Edwin's forces. She thought about the scars along Cale's forearm, the betrayal he had described from years earlier that had shaped so much of his cautious, protective leadership style, and she prayed silently that this confrontation would not add fresh wounds to those old ones, whether physical or emotional. Word arrived periodically throughout the day from messengers who returned to the stronghold with updates on the unfolding situation at the border. The early reports described a tense standoff, with both sides positioned along the boundary line but neither yet willing to escalate into direct engagement. Elena found some comfort in this news, hoping that perhaps careful diplomacy and clear demonstration of Blackthorn's strength might yet avoid the more serious conflict everyone had feared. As the afternoon wore on, however, the reports grew more concerning, describing increasing aggression from Edwin's forces and mounting difficulty in maintaining the careful restraint that had characterized the standoff's early hours. Late in the afternoon, a messenger arrived at the stronghold, with news that finally broke the tense stillness Elena had endured throughout the day. Edwin's forces had attempted to push across the boundary in force, testing Blackthorn's defenses directly, and a confrontation had occurred that, while intense, had ultimately resulted in Edwin's warriors being repelled back across the border, without any of Cale's people suffering serious harm. The messenger explained that Cale himself had led the response with the fierce, commanding presence that had made him legendary throughout the territory, and that Edwin's forces had retreated in disarray, once it became clear that Blackthorn's defenses remained as formidable as ever. Elena felt overwhelming relief at this news, though she would not fully believe it until she saw Cale safely returned within the stronghold's walls herself. That reunion came a few hours later, as dusk settled over the forest, and Cale finally returned, tired and bearing minor injuries from the day's confrontation, but fundamentally unharmed. Elena rushed to meet him the moment word spread of his arrival, and when she finally saw him, standing tall despite the visible exhaustion of the day's events, she felt tears of relief streaming down her face before she could fully compose herself. He embraced her tightly, and for a long moment neither of them spoke, simply grateful for the safety of the other after a day filled with uncertainty and danger. Eventually, he explained the full details of the confrontation, describing how his forces had successfully held the border against Edwin's most aggressive push yet, though he acknowledged with clear concern that the scale of this attempt suggested Edwin's ambitions had grown more serious than the earlier, smaller incursions had indicated. He believed, based on the intensity of today's confrontation, that Edwin would likely regroup and attempt an even more significant challenge in the near future, rather than accepting this defeat as a final resolution to his territorial ambitions. That evening, as the stronghold settled into an uneasy quiet following the day's dramatic events, Elena helped tend to the minor injuries Cale and several of his warriors had sustained during the confrontation, working alongside Mira and others experienced in traditional healing methods passed down through generations of pack tradition. She found herself grateful for something practical to occupy her hands and attention after the anxious helplessness of waiting throughout the day, and she noticed Kale watching her with quiet appreciation as she worked carefully to clean and bandage a wound along his shoulder. Once his injuries had been properly tended, Kale called a meeting of his senior advisors to discuss the implications of the day's confrontation and plan their strategy for the challenges likely still to come. Rurik attended this meeting as well, though Elena noticed a tension in his posture that seemed different from his usual guarded reserve, something that struck her as closer to genuine unease than simple disagreement with pack policy. She mentioned this observation to Callum quietly after the meeting concluded, and he admitted that he too had noticed something unusual in Rurik's behavior throughout the day's events, though he had been too occupied with the immediate demands of the border confrontation to investigate further. Kale, informed of these renewed concerns, decided that the time had come to address the situation with Rurik directly, rather than continuing to gather evidence through quiet observation alone. He resolved to speak with his senior advisor the following morning, hoping to either resolve whatever uncertainty had crept into their long-standing relationship of trust, or confirm the troubling possibility that Rurik had, in some capacity, compromised his loyalty to the pack he had served faithfully for so many years. Elena offered to be present for this conversation, but Kale gently declined, explaining that this matter required a private conversation between himself and Rurik, given the weight of history and trust that existed between them, independent of her own presence within the stronghold. That night, as Elena prepared for sleep in her chamber, she found herself unable to fully shake a lingering sense of unease, despite the successful defense of the border and the relative safety of Kale's return. She thought about Rurik's unusual behavior throughout the day, about the hushed conversation with the unfamiliar messenger she had witnessed weeks earlier, about the careful, methodical way threats seemed to be accumulating around her presence within this forest she had come to love so deeply. She resolved, as sleep finally began to claim her exhausted mind, that whatever challenges the coming days brought, she would face them with the same courage and determination that had carried her safely through every danger since the night she first crossed into Blackthorn Forest, refusing to let fear diminish the life and love she had found within these ancient walls. The following morning arrived with a deceptive calm, sunlight filtering gently through the forest canopy, as though the previous day's dramatic confrontation had never occurred. Elena woke early, drawn by an instinct she could not fully explain toward the window of her chamber, watching the quiet activity beginning to stir across the stronghold grounds below. She thought about Kale's planned conversation with Rurik, wondering with growing anxiety what truth that confrontation might ultimately reveal, and whether the pack's hard-won unity could withstand whatever answers emerged from questions that had been quietly accumulating for weeks. Kale found Rurik in the quiet solitude of the eastern watchtower shortly after dawn, a location the senior advisor had favored for private reflection for as long as Kale could remember. He climbed the narrow stone stairs alone, having decided against bringing Callum or any other witness to this conversation, hoping that a private exchange between two men who had known each other for decades might yield honesty that a more formal confrontation would not. Rurik turned as Kale entered the small chamber atop the tower, his expression carefully composed but unable to fully hide the tension that had clearly been building beneath his controlled exterior for some time. Kale did not waste time with careful diplomatic language, choosing instead to speak directly, asking Rurik plainly whether he had maintained any communication with parties outside Blackthorn territory regarding Elena's presence within the stronghold or the pack's broader strategic decisions. Rurik's expression flickered with something that looked almost like relief at the direct question, as though he had been waiting, perhaps even hoping, for this confrontation to finally arrive. He admitted, after a long moment of heavy silence, that he had indeed been in contact with representatives connected to Edwin Voss's territory, though he insisted immediately and firmly that his intentions had never included betraying Blackthorn's security or contributing to any genuine harm against the pack he had served his entire life. Kale felt a cold weight settle in his chest at this confirmation, though he kept his expression carefully controlled as he pressed Rurik for a fuller explanation. Rurik explained, his voice heavy with what sounded like genuine regret, that he had reached out to Edwin's representatives initially, out of a desperate hope to negotiate some resolution that would remove Elena from Blackthorn territory without requiring open conflict, believing sincerely that her continued presence represented an unacceptable risk to everyone he had sworn to protect. He insisted that he had never intended to provide information that would compromise the pack's defenses, that his communications had focused solely on exploring diplomatic alternatives to the confrontation he feared Elena's presence would inevitably provoke. Kale listened to this explanation with a complicated mixture of anger and understanding, recognizing in Rurik's misguided actions the same fierce protective instinct that had shaped his own harsh leadership style following the betrayal he had experienced years earlier. He asked directly whether Rurik had shared any information about the pack's defensive strategies or troop movements during his communications with Edwin's representatives, information that could explain the increasingly aggressive and well-timed nature of the recent border incursions. Rurik hesitated at this question, his composure finally cracking fully, as he admitted, with obvious shame, that he had indeed shared certain details about patrol schedules and defensive preparations, believing at the time that such information served only to demonstrate Blackthorn's strength and discourage, rather than encourage, further aggression. The full weight of this admission settled heavily over the small tower chamber. Kale understood now that Rurik's misguided attempt at independent diplomacy had, whether intentionally or not, provided Edwin's forces with exactly the strategic advantage they needed to time their incursions with such troubling precision. He felt the sharp sting of this betrayal deeply, not merely as a leader whose security had been compromised, but as a man who had trusted Rurik as a friend and advisor for the better part of 2 decades. He asked, his voice tight with barely controlled emotion, whether Rurik understood the full danger his actions had created, not just for the pack's broader security, but specifically for Elena, whose safety now hung in greater jeopardy because of information Rurik had shared, believing he was protecting everyone involved. Rurik's expression crumbled fully at this direct confrontation with the consequences of his actions, and he admitted that he had not fully anticipated how Edwin's representatives would use the information he provided, that he had convinced himself throughout the process that his careful, limited disclosures posed no genuine risk to the pack's security. He apologized repeatedly, his voice thick with genuine remorse, explaining that his fear for the pack's future, rooted in decades of loyal service and genuine love for the community he had helped build, had led him to make choices he now recognized as deeply misguided and dangerous, regardless of whatever good intentions had originally motivated them. Kale struggled to reconcile his anger with the genuine history of loyalty and friendship that had defined his relationship with Rurik across so many years of shared leadership. He informed Rurik firmly that his actions constituted a serious breach of trust that could not go without consequence, regardless of whatever misguided good intentions had originally motivated them. But he also acknowledged, with some difficulty, that he understood the fear that had driven Rurik towards such a dangerous and ultimately counterproductive course of action. He instructed Rurik to remain confined to the stronghold under close watch, while he determined an appropriate response to this breach of trust, a decision that fell far short of the more severe punishment tradition might have demanded, but that reflected Kale's genuine struggle to balance justice with the complicated history of loyalty that still existed between them. News of Rurik's confession spread quickly through the stronghold once Kale informed Callum and his other senior advisors of what had transpired in the Eastern Watchtower. Elena learned of the revelation from Mira, who arrived at her chamber with an expression of obvious distress, explaining what had happened and the danger it suggested for the immediate future, given that Edwin's forces now likely possessed detailed knowledge of Blackthorn's defensive capabilities. Elena felt a fresh wave of fear settle over her, understanding that whatever fragile security she had begun to feel within these walls now faced its most serious test yet. She sought out Kale later that morning, finding him in his study reviewing defensive strategies with renewed urgency, given this troubling new understanding of how much information Edwin's forces now possessed. He explained the full details of his conversation with Rurik, his expression heavy with the complicated emotions of betrayal, understanding, and renewed determination to protect his people despite this significant setback. Elena listened carefully, offering what comfort she could, understanding the particular pain of discovering that someone trusted for so long had, even with good intentions, contributed to danger that now threatened everyone she had come to care for so deeply. Kale explained that he now believed Edwin would likely attempt a far more significant assault in the very near future, armed with detailed knowledge of Blackthorn's defensive patterns and vulnerabilities that Rurik's misguided communications had inadvertently provided. He immediately began revising every aspect of the pack's defensive strategy, changing patrol patterns, adjusting troop positions, and taking every possible measure to counteract the advantage Edwin's forces had gained through Rurik's compromised loyalty. Elena threw herself into assisting with these preparations, determined to help however she could given the gravity of the threat now facing the entire community she had come to consider her home. As the day progressed, Kale also sent urgent messages to the allied packs who had previously pledged their support, requesting that they accelerate their preparations to provide reinforcement given the increased likelihood of imminent conflict. He worked tirelessly throughout the day, coordinating with Callum and his other trusted advisors to ensure every aspect of Blackthorn's defense had been thoroughly reconsidered in light of the compromised information Edwin now possessed. Elena watched him work with growing admiration for his resilience, his ability to absorb this significant betrayal and immediately channel his energy into protecting his people, rather than succumbing to despair or paralysis in the face of such a serious setback. That evening, exhausted from a day filled with urgent preparation and difficult emotional reckoning, Kale and Elena finally found a quiet moment together in his study. The map of Blackthorn territory still spread across his desk, now marked with fresh symbols indicating the revised defensive strategy they had spent the day developing. He admitted to her, in a rare moment of open vulnerability, that Rurik's betrayal, however well-intentioned, had cut deeper than he wanted to acknowledge, reminding him painfully of the earlier betrayal that had shaped so much of his cautious, protective leadership style over the years. Elena reached for his hand across the desk, offering what comfort she could through simple physical presence, rather than empty words that could not fully address the complicated pain he carried. She told him that his willingness to show mercy toward Rurik, despite the serious consequences of his actions, rather than resorting to the harsh punishment tradition might have demanded, demonstrated exactly the kind of wisdom and compassion that made him worthy of the loyalty his pack showed him so consistently. Kale studied her for a long moment, clearly moved by her words, before pulling her into a tight embrace that spoke more clearly than any words could, of the depth of gratitude and love he felt for her presence in his life, even amid the mounting dangers that now threatened everything they had built together. The attack came 3 nights later, under cover of a moonless sky that Edwin Voss had clearly chosen deliberately to maximize the advantage his forces might gain from darkness and surprise. Scouts posted along the revised patrol routes Kale had established sounded the alarm just after midnight, reporting a large force moving swiftly through the forest toward the stronghold itself, rather than testing the outer boundaries as previous incursions had done. Kale understood immediately what this meant. Armed with the detailed knowledge Rurik had inadvertently provided, Edwin had decided against another cautious probe of Blackthorn's defenses, and instead committed to a direct assault aimed at striking the heart of the pack's territory before adequate defenses could be mounted. The stronghold erupted into organized chaos as warriors rushed to their designated positions, following the revised defensive strategy Kale had spent days refining with his advisors. Elena found herself swept along in this urgent activity, guided quickly by Mira toward the same secure inner chamber where she had waited anxiously during the earlier border confrontation. This time, however, the danger felt far more immediate and personal, given that Edwin's forces were pushing directly toward the stronghold itself, rather than remaining contained at a distant boundary line. Kale found her briefly before taking his position at the front of Blackthorn's defense, his expression fierce with the focused determination she had come to associate with the Alpha King the old stories described. Though beneath that fierce exterior, she could still see the man who had shown her such gentle care across the weeks of their growing bond. He held her close for one brief, urgent moment, promising that he would keep both her and his people safe, before departing to lead his warriors against the approaching threat. Elena watched him go with her heart pounding, praying silently that his promise would prove true despite the mounting danger that seemed to surround them from every direction. The sounds of conflict reached the secure chamber even through its thick stone walls, distant but unmistakable. Growls and shouts and the clash of what she assumed were weapons carried faintly on the night air. Elena paced anxiously alongside Mira and several other members of the pack sheltering in the chamber, unable to fully suppress the fear that had settled over her, despite her determination to remain calm and supportive for those around her. She thought about Kale facing Edwin's forces, about Callum and Nolan and all the other warriors she had come to know and care for over her weeks within the stronghold, all of them now facing genuine danger because of a conflict that had originated, at least in part, from the pursuit that had driven her into this forest in the first place. The chamber door burst open unexpectedly nearly an hour into the confrontation, and Elena's heart leapt into her throat before she recognized the figure standing in the doorway, as Rurik, released from his confinement, and carrying an expression of fierce determination, rather than the shame and regret she had grown accustomed to seeing on his face over the past several days. He explained quickly, his words urgent, that a small group of Edwin's warriors had broken through the outer defenses and were making their way directly toward this section of the stronghold, likely aware of Elena's location through information he now bitterly regretted having ever shared. He had come, he explained, to help defend the chamber and correct, in whatever small way he could, the danger his earlier misguided actions had helped create. Elena felt a complicated rush of emotions at his presence, gratitude for his evident determination to make amends, mixed with lingering wariness, given the history of his actions that had contributed to this very crisis. There was no time to fully process these feelings, however, as the sounds of approaching conflict grew steadily closer, confirming Rurik's warning about the immediate threat bearing down on their location. Rurik positioned himself at the chamber entrance, alongside the guards already stationed there, and Elena found herself drawn, despite every instinct toward self-preservation, to stand ready to help defend the space, rather than cowering passively in the corner, while others risked themselves on her behalf. The confrontation, when it arrived, unfolded with a speed and intensity that left Elena's heart racing, long after the immediate danger had passed. A small group of Edwin's warriors pushed through the outer guards with brutal determination, clearly under specific orders, to reach the chamber where they believed Elena was being held. Rurik fought alongside the stronghold's guards with a fierce, focused intensity that spoke of his genuine desire to protect the pack and correct his earlier mistakes, while Elena pressed herself against the far wall of the chamber alongside Mira, watching the confrontation unfold with a mixture of terror and desperate hope that their defenders would prevail. Just as the situation seemed most dire, with the intruding warriors pushing dangerously close to breaching the chamber's inner defenses, a chorus of low growls announced the arrival of reinforcement from an unexpected direction. Bryn and several other wolves who had appointed themselves as Elena's protectors weeks earlier burst into the chamber from a side passage, moving with a speed and ferocity that quickly overwhelmed the remaining intruders. Elena watched with a strange mixture of fear and awe as the wolves that had first found her in the clearing so many weeks ago now fought fiercely to protect the same bond they had recognized from the very beginning, their loyalty to her proving as unshakable in this moment of genuine crisis as it had been that first confused night. The combined defense of Rurik, the stronghold's guards, and the fiercely loyal wolves ultimately proved successful, driving back the intruders who had breached the outer defenses and securing the chamber against further immediate threat. As the sounds of conflict began to fade, replaced by the exhausted quiet that follows any intense confrontation, Elena found herself trembling with adrenaline and relief, grateful beyond words for the protection that had surrounded her from so many unexpected sources during this most dangerous night of her life within Blackthorn Forest. Word soon arrived that the broader confrontation at the stronghold's main defenses had also concluded successfully, with Kale's forces, bolstered by the timely arrival of reinforcements from two of the allied packs, who had rushed to fulfill their earlier pledges of support, ultimately repelling Edwin's assault and forcing his remaining warriors into a disorganized retreat back toward their own territory. Elena felt overwhelming relief at this news, though she would not fully believe the danger had passed until she saw Kale himself, safely returned and unharmed from the night's dramatic events. That reunion came shortly before dawn, as Kale made his way through the stronghold, checking on the safety of his people, following the intense confrontation. When he finally reached the chamber where Elena had sheltered throughout the attack, his relief at finding her safe was evident in every line of his exhausted but grateful expression. He embraced her tightly, and Elena felt tears streaming down her face as she finally allowed herself to fully process the fear and uncertainty of the night's events, now that the immediate danger had genuinely passed. Kale listened with evident gratitude as Elena and Mira explained how Rurik had helped defend the chamber, how the wolves had arrived just in time to secure their protection against Edwin's most determined attempt to reach her. He turned to Rurik, who stood nearby looking exhausted but quietly proud of his contribution to the night's successful defense, and expressed his genuine gratitude for the courage and loyalty he had shown in helping protect Elena, despite the earlier breach of trust that had contributed to this very crisis. Rurik accepted this acknowledgement with visible emotion, and Kale, in a gesture that spoke to his fundamental character as a leader who valued redemption and genuine growth over rigid punishment, announced that Rurik's earlier confinement would be lifted, given the courage and loyalty he had demonstrated when it mattered most. As dawn finally broke fully over Blackthorn Forest, illuminating a stronghold that had weathered its most significant test yet, Elena stood beside Kale, surveying the exhausted but resilient community that had fought so fiercely to protect both their territory and the bond that had grown between their alpha and the woman his own wolves had refused to let him harm so many weeks earlier. Edwin Voss's ambitions had been decisively repelled, at least for now, and the treachery that had briefly threatened to fracture the pack's unity from within had instead, through Rurik's genuine remorse and courageous redemption, ultimately strengthened the bonds of loyalty and trust that held their community together. Whatever challenges still remained ahead, Elena understood, standing there in the golden light of a new morning, that she had found within these ancient walls not merely safety, but a true and lasting home. In the weeks following the failed assault on Blackthorn territory, a fragile but genuine peace settled over the forest and its people. Word eventually reached Kale through his network of allies that Edwin Voss, having suffered significant losses during the failed attack and facing growing unrest among his own warriors who questioned the wisdom of his aggressive ambitions, had withdrawn any further plans to challenge Blackthorn's borders, at least for the foreseeable future. The broker who had originally orchestrated Elena's pursuit, exposed through the connections Kale's allies had uncovered during their investigation, found his reputation and network of contacts significantly damaged once word spread through the hidden supernatural community of his role in provoking such a costly and ultimately failed conflict. Elena felt the weight of months of fear and uncertainty finally beginning to lift as these threats resolved, replaced by a growing sense of security and belonging that she had never fully expected to find when she first fled her old life in desperate panic. She spent her days now not as a prisoner or even simply a guest within the stronghold, but as a genuine and valued member of the community. Her contributions to the pack's defense and her growing knowledge of Guardian bloodline history earning her respect and affection from nearly everyone she encountered throughout the fortress and its surrounding territory. Her relationship with Rurik, once so fraught with tension and suspicion, had transformed into something approaching genuine friendship, built on the foundation of his courageous actions during the attack, and his obvious, ongoing commitment to earning back the full trust he had temporarily forfeited through his earlier misguided choices. He often sought her company now during quiet afternoons, sharing stories about the pack's history and offering the kind of careful, thoughtful counsel that had made him such a valued advisor to Kale across so many years of loyal service. Elena found herself genuinely grateful for this transformation, understanding that the strength of any community lay not in the absence of mistakes, but in the willingness to acknowledge them honestly and work toward genuine redemption. Kale, meanwhile, had begun the careful process of fulfilling the promise he had made to Elena weeks earlier, preparing for a formal ceremony that would acknowledge their bond before the entire pack, according to traditions that stretched back generations within Blackthorn territory. He explained to Elena, as they walked together through the same clearing where his wolves had first found her so many months earlier, that such ceremonies carried deep significance within pack culture, representing not merely a personal commitment between two individuals, but a formal acknowledgement recognized by the entire community, binding their futures together in a way that honored both ancient tradition and their own genuine, freely chosen love. Elena listened to his explanation with growing excitement, understanding fully now the significance of what he was offering her. A place not merely as someone protected by pack instinct, but as an equal partner in shaping the future of this community she had come to love so deeply. She thought back to the terrified, exhausted woman who had stumbled into this forest so many months earlier, fleeing danger she barely understood, and marveled at how completely her life had transformed since that fateful night, guided by wolves who had recognized something in her that she herself had not yet fully understood. The day of the ceremony arrived on a clear, bright morning, as autumn began giving way to the first hints of winter, the forest canopy painted in brilliant shades of gold and crimson, that seemed to Elena like nature's own celebration of the joy she felt as she prepared for the momentous occasion ahead. Mira helped her dress in traditional garments that had been carefully prepared by the pack's most skilled artisans, simple but elegant, woven with subtle patterns that Mira explained represented protection, loyalty, and the deep connection between the guardian bloodlines and the wolves they had been destined to protect for countless generations. The entire pack gathered in the great hall for the ceremony. Warriors and healers, elders and children, every member of the community Elena had come to know and love during her months within the stronghold now assembled to witness the formal acknowledgement of the bond between their alpha and the woman his own wolves had refused to let him harm on that first fateful night. Elena felt a flutter of nervous excitement as she made her way through the hall, catching sight of familiar, welcoming faces at every turn. From Callum's proud smile, to Nolan's enthusiastic wave, to Rurik's quiet, respectful nod that spoke volumes about the journey their relationship had traveled since her arrival. Kale waited for her at the head of the hall, dressed in formal attire that emphasized the commanding presence she had first encountered in that dark clearing so many months earlier, though now his expression held none of the harsh authority that had once defined his reputation throughout the forest, replaced instead by open, unguarded joy that made her heart swell with love for this complex, deeply honorable man who had risked everything to protect her from the very first moment their paths had crossed. As she reached him, he took her hands in his, and the ceremony began, guided by ancient words spoken by the pack's eldest member, binding their futures together, according to traditions that stretched back countless generations within Blackthorn territory. The ceremony itself unfolded with a beauty and solemnity that left Elena deeply moved, ancient words spoken in a language she did not fully understand, but that carried a weight and significance she felt deeply nonetheless, culminating in a moment where the assembled wolves of the pack, led by Bryn, who had first recognized Elena's bloodline in that dark clearing, gathered around them both in a circle of protection and blessing that formally recognized the bond now sealed between their alpha and his chosen mate. Elena felt tears of joy streaming down her face as the ceremony concluded, and when Kale finally pulled her into his arms, before the entire assembled pack, the cheers and celebration that erupted throughout the great hall confirmed everything she had come to understand about the genuine warmth and acceptance this community had extended to her across her months within their forest. The celebration that followed stretched long into the evening, filled with music, dancing, and the kind of joyful community warmth that Elena had never fully experienced before finding her way into Blackthorn Forest. She danced with Kale beneath the great hall's high wooden beams, surrounded by people who had become genuine friends and family across the months of her unexpected journey, and she thought back once more to that terrified night when she had first crossed the forest's boundary, fleeing danger she barely understood, never imagining that such a desperate flight would ultimately lead her to the deepest happiness and belonging she had ever known. Later that night, as the celebration finally began to wind down and the stronghold settled into peaceful quiet, Kale led Elena to the same balcony where they had first acknowledged the depth of their growing feelings for each other so many weeks earlier. They stood together, looking out over the darkened forest canopy, now formally bound as partners in leading and protecting the community that had become their shared home. Kale told her softly that Blackthorn Forest, once known throughout the region only for the fierce, absolute justice enforced against any trespasser who dared cross its borders, would now stand as something more, a symbol of the protection and belonging that a guardian bloodline could bring to a community wise enough to recognize and honor such a rare and precious bond. Elena rested her head against his shoulder, feeling a deep and abiding peace settle over her as she looked out at the forest that had once seemed so terrifying and forbidden, now transformed in her eyes into the truest home she had ever known. She thought about her grandmother, about the ancient legacy she had never fully understood, until circumstances forced her to discover it in the most unexpected way possible, and she felt certain, standing there in Kale's arms beneath the star-filled autumn sky, that her grandmother would have been proud to see the woman she had become, and the love and belonging she had found within a forest once known only for the fierce justice its alpha king enforced against every trespasser who dared to cross his boundaries. The wolves who had once protected a frightened stranger now stood as guardians of a queen who had earned her place among them, not merely through ancient bloodline, but through the courage, loyalty, and genuine love she had shown every single member of the community that had become, at last, entirely and completely her own.